Good evening. Welcome to the Westport Coffee House Theater. It's just a quick question. Is this the first time for anybody in this venue? First time for you? Awesome. Okay. Well, if you want to hear some good jazz, you need to get on their Facebook page and sign up on their Facebook page because they post all the time. They bring in students from the college that play here on several nights. They have some of our seasoned musicians in town that play here a lot.
SOBs play here.
Yep. Sons of Brazil have been playing here. So it's become one of the really premier venues here in Kansas City. So we're really thankful for Tom and Pam. Tom owns the place, and he has just been a wonderful asset to the jazz community. So yeah, thank you for giving Tom a hand. I also want to thank Christian Neurath, who does our video stuff, and we have a Facebook Live page of the event that goes on. So he's always been great for us. And then I need to read off some different things because my memory's not that good. We couldn't do this about the funding from several different places, especially the Neighborhood Tourist and Development Fund of Kansas City, Missouri is one of our big funders for this particular series, as well as these banners that you see up behind us. And also I want to thank the Muriel McBrien Kauffman Foundation, the Francis Family Foundation, and ArtsKC for their support of Kansas City Jazz Alive. In the audience tonight, we've got our president, Christopher Burnett, our vice president, B.J. Jansen, our treasurer, Emily Behrman, who's hiding on me back there, and I'm also on the board, do secretary work and stuff on that. And then we also have one of our founding members, Mr. Steve Hargrave, was a founder for Kansas City Jazz Alive. And even though he doesn't sit on the board right now, he still does a lot to really keep things active and stuff. So, you didn't come here to hear me talk, but I will ask you, oh yeah, I know you want to hear me talk, Steve. If you haven't looked at these banners before, these ones that we have up today are just really key for the discussion that we're having tonight because we've got Andy Kirk, we've got Walter Page, Mary Lou Williams, Benny Moten, Count Basie, and Jay McShann, who are all instrumental with the regional bands here in Kansas City and really developing the sound, which you're going to hear about as our panel discusses that today. So without further ado, I want to bring up Steve Kraske, the host for KCUR's Up to Date, and our moderator extraordinaire to kick off the program.
Thank you, everybody. Chuck, Clint, come on up. You know, I really like our topic today. We're going to talk about the Kansas City jazz sound. And everyone might have a different definition of what we're talking about. In my lifetime here in town, when I think of the real raw Kansas City jazz sound, I think of the Scamps, sort of unpolished, down and dirty, all that stuff. And I love that sound. I miss that sound. That's what I think about. And we're going to have our two experts here sort of dissect the history of the Kansas City jazz sound as we go through our topic here today. I don't need to introduce these two guys, but for the sake of formalities, I'm going to do it anyway. Chuck Haddix is sitting to my right here, my colleague at KCUR, longtime, obviously, host of the Fish Fry. He's co-author of Kansas City Jazz from Ragtime to Bebop, A History, and Bird, The Life and Music of Charlie Parker. Let's hear it for Chuck. Director of the Marr Sound Archives, too. Clint Ashlock is sitting next to him. He's obviously the head of the Kansas City Jazz Orchestra, the conductor, trumpeter, composer, band leader, lecturer. Let's give it up for Clint being here, too. So, Chuck, let me start with you here. The Kansas City jazz sound. Why is it important today, and does it still exist in your mind?
Well, can you guys hear me okay?
Why don't you grab that thing? Grab it,
Yeah,
hold it up
grab
to
it
you.
here. Yeah.
Like you mean it, Chuck, like you're singing, dude.
All right. I'm used to going, good evening, welcome to the Fish Fry, I'm Chuck Haddock. Well, the Kansas City Jazz is important. Kansas City has always been a jazz town.
Yeah.
I was looking on Facebook the other day, and there was this tree with names of jazz greats and jazz cities on it, and Kansas City wasn't there. And I almost posted something, in response, but there were 4 cradles of jazz. Jazz was really born in New Orleans, and then it moved up by rail and river up to Chicago, and then of course it came of age in New York and Kansas City. And so Kansas City has always been a jazz town. Claude Fiddler Williams often talked about the Kansas City stamp. He said if a Kansas City musician went any place in the country and sat in on a jam session, they would know he was from Kansas City by the way he played. It had a distinctive style.
Is it still that way?
I think so, yeah. The young musicians that are coming up today are an extension of what was before them. The tradition has always been passed along. Ahmed Al-Din talked about that.
Yeah.
How he learned from, Ahmed Al-Din talked about standing in front of the Boulevard Room, which was on 12th and Vine, and having Charlie Parker walk up the street. He's that connection to the earlier tradition. Yet he mentored, and Charlie Parker did the same thing, younger musicians, and the younger musicians picked up on what he was doing and then added their thing to it. And now Chris Burnett and I used to hang out with the old guys. Now we are the old guys. So Chris Burnett, picked up on what Ahmed Al-Din was doing, and now Chris is continuing that tradition, just as Clint is too. The tradition jams on is the motto of the foundation, and it literally does.
Is the Kansas City jazz sound, Clint, in your view, is that still around?
As long as there's a Kansas City and as long as there's jazz in Kansas City, I think so. You think of all the practitioners that we're surrounded by, including the youngster on the panel, Jay McShann. We think of Kansas City, the Kansas City sound, as an historic sort of thing, and we look at something that was established and documented, and we can listen to it at length, especially Spotify and Apple Music and everything. You can listen to almost everything that is that I knew of when I was a kid, for sure. Chuck has a bunch of secret things stashed away at the Marr, but history, we look back on something 50 years ago and it had already been established, but I think we have to remember that art comes from the artists, and the regionality of the music, like Chuck said, is something that's passed through our mentors and our predecessors, but just by the nature of being in a place, I think whatever you hear out in the world or in Kansas City today, that's Kansas City jazz, and it's informed by different things. One of the quotes on that page was from Carmel Jones, or was about Carmel Jones, who I've listened to a lot of Carmel Jones. I know you have. But you listen to Jayhawk talk, or you listen to him on Song from My Father, he doesn't sound like Sweets Edison. He doesn't sound like Buck Clayton. He sounds a lot more like Clifford Brown or Lee Morgan or his contemporaries, Kenny Dorham. Even if you get super picky about it, his swing vibe isn't super Kansas City on those records. It doesn't have the kind of lope to it that Sweets or those people had. But he's still definitely a Kansas City trumpet player. He's still definitely a Kansas City musician. And so that spirit and that soul that he grew up with and took out into the world is more, to me, the regionality of the music than, what was the swing feel like, or how many times did he repeat a riff.
So even today, Clint, if you went to New York, you went to New Orleans, you went to Chicago, you think you could distinguish local musicians? You'd be able to hear the sound of that part of the country and the way they play?
Maybe. I think, if you listen to Pat Metheny play, there are certainly things that you could like dissect out of his music compositionally that might evoke the broad prairie sky or something, but his lines when he play, I don't think they sound like traditional Kansas City style. Right. But on the other hand, I think like Wynton Marsalis said it pretty well. I was at the playing the late set back in the early 2000s, and he walked in and we were playing a blues with a friend of mine, a piano player, and he was like, Kansas City. It's like, okay.
Yeah. He knew.
Fine.
Yeah, he knew. You can tell right. I can tell right away. So, Chuck, the Kansas City sound of 1930 versus the Kansas City sound of 2024, is it different? The same? What is it?
Oh, it's different. It's definitely different. It's a different time, of course. You know, one of the things that distinguished Kansas City jazz style over the other cradles of jazz is it developed very quickly in a 20-year period of time between 1920 and 1940. It went from ragtime to bebop. James Scott published Don't Jazz Me Rag on Music in 1920. By 1940, it's been well documented, Charlie Parker was playing bebop in Kansas City. And, there's a lot of, when I did my Kansas City book, I first started hanging out in Kansas City in the jazz scene in the early 1970s, hanging out at Milton Morris's tap room.
Right.
Milton lived not far from me, so I'd give Milton a ride home and listen to these fantastic stories. And then I started hanging out at the foundation. And at that time, you still had, everybody was still around. Ernie Daniels, Last of the Blue Devils, was still around. So was Jay McShann. I was buddies with Step Buddy Anderson and Piggy Minor. And, and I'd go down there for the late night sessions. And that's really where I learned about Kansas City jazz. And these guys told these fantastic stories. And, we don't want to, we want to recognize where we came from and pay homage to that tradition, but we don't want to be bound by that tradition. Like Kansas City Jazz Orchestra, it's a repertoire band. And they play the modern stuff, but they can still play the swinging stuff too. And when Count Basie came along, it's hard to underestimate or understate how much Kansas City jazz influenced music nationally, particularly the Count Basie band. Benny Moten died before he could break out nationally. Really, he went to New York a number of times. But it was Basie that reinvigorated the swing movement. And it did so because he was playing differently than Ellington, Fletcher Henderson, Earl Father Hines. Kansas City jazz has always been based in the blues. Big Joe Turner embodies that. And, and the great big hits of the Kansas City tradition are Swingin' the Blues, Jumpin' the Blues, Charlie Parker with KC Blues. And so it had this distinguished sound and then a hard swinging style because they were playing head arrangements, which allowed them to not collectively improvise, but to, how shall I put this? Clint, you're better at this than I am.
They didn't have a curfew, right? They had to make it up. They'd create the arrangements on the spot. So one saxophone player might play, and the next night the other guy was like, "Hey, that thing you played, let's play that again."
Well, it was riff based, where the sections were playing riffs, backing up the solos, and riffs were not new. New York bands have been using riffs all along. Particularly Ellington, particularly Fletcher Henderson. But in Kansas City, Eddie Durham and Count Basie, who were the architects of the Kansas City sound, used the riffs in a more pronounced manner.
You began this conversation by saying you were looking at this map today or the other day, the cradles of jazz across the country, Kansas City not listed. Is there a concern that Kansas City's contribution here, which you described as so profound, is it getting lost with time?
No, I think it's coming into closer focus because the research goes on. I used to think that Kansas City jazz really ended with World War II, which changed everything. That really ended the big band tradition and began with the cleanup. But it never really ended. It continued, just with a different style and different musicians. For example, And also, the Conservatory of Music and Dance has been largely overlooked, the contribution. George Salisbury learned from Mary Lou Williams in the 1930s. I was at a concert at Rockhurst, a little kind of a pocket concert with Mary Lou playing her history of jazz.
Wow.
And there was probably 6, 7 people there, and George Salisbury was with me. And when she walked in the room and saw George, she went over and hugged him. And I shook hands with her. Man, when you shook hands with her, you shook hands with somebody that had a powerful grip. But then George went on, and he taught at the Conservatory of Music. He wasn't the first African American to teach there, and he taught classical as well as jazz. And he went on to teach, some of the Kansas City's leading pianists. Tim Whitmer studied with George. So did Joe Cartwright, although George told Joe, from what I understand, to find a new teacher because he couldn't teach him anything, because he already knew everything. So, so the tradition kind of goes on. I think there's a place in Kansas City, though, for a band that plays the traditional style. The Grand Marquis is one of those bands that does that. I mean, they mix it up quite a bit. If you go to New York and go to Birdland on Monday night, you'll see Vince Giordano. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Vince plays, he's inspired by the Coon Sanders' original Nighthawk Orchestra, which was one of the leading bands here at White Band in Kansas City in the early 1920s. They're a very, very important band that's often overlooked. So he plays the traditional stuff, and people go there. But that doesn't mean they're not going to go up to Harlem and see a Greasy Organ Trio, too.
I don't know about you guys, but the history that Chuck has in his head, it's like he's talking about Monday afternoon here or something. It's just amazing to me, I want to see if this helps a little bit. Mosaic Records, Daryl sent this to me. Mosaic Records said this about Kansas City Jazz on its website, and it's promoting a Carmel Jones compilation CD. It's about 3 sentences here. For musicians, jazz is traditionally so much about where you live. You could be East Coast, West Coast, Chicago, New Orleans. You inhabit a place and you habit an attitude, and that's home for you. When you talk about jazz that comes out of Kansas City, you're talking about a style that's extremely pure and identifiable. It's riff-driven, as Chuck said, hard-swinging dance music. Kansas City jazz gets its hooks into you and doesn't let you go. What it lacks in harmonic sophistication, it more than makes up for with the complexity of its rhythmic riffs and its high regard for spirited soloing. Think about the driving arrangements of Count Basie, of Big Joe Turner's tuneful boom over Pete Johnson's boogie piano. Does that sound about right to you, Clint? Is that a pretty good working definition?
I think it's a great definition for 1955. I think that, one thing we tend to do in Kansas City is we're so excited about our history, which we should be. I mean, I am. I know I am. But some of the things that were said in there, what it lacks in harmonic sophistication, that certainly would have been true versus maybe, New York music in 1955 or so forth. But the history has continued to be written from then until today. And, you look at Bobby Watson's music. Now, I think Bobby, I would almost argue universally could be looked at as someone who embodies the Kansas City heritage and the sound. I mean, he's very swinging, very soulful. You can always find the blues in there. But his music is incredibly harmonically sophisticated. So to me, that quote is great to look at the first 50 years of Kansas City jazz music. But I think we do need to remember that history has continued to be written, and it has evolved just like so many other things evolve over time.
Yeah. Chuck, talk a little bit more about that incubator aspect of Kansas City jazz. Was it different here than it was elsewhere, or the music has always been sort of steeped in that idea of passing it down like Aladdin did for so many players here in town?
Well, similar conditions came together in these cradles of jazz to create these jazz cities. And you had a corrupt government under the leadership of, wasn't in the government, but had a Democratic Party, Jackson County Democrat. You had Tom Pendergast. Pendergast loved gambling he loved liquor. He was in the liquor business, and he was reportedly a very big gambler too. And Kansas City was kind of a Wild West town, the point of departure for the wagon trains, always the westward city. And so there was a lot of clubs here in Kansas City during the Great Depression and during Prohibition too. And so what you had was work for musicians, and that's what drives the whole thing, is work for musicians. And also you had, of course, the union, Local 627, which was an African-American union established in 1917. And that afforded musicians who were members the same privileges, the same pay, and a lot of the same privileges as their white counterparts in 34. They didn't merge until 1970. Mm-hmm. And so you had a strong union, you had a lot of clubs to play in, and a lot of work for musicians. Mary Lou Williams recalled 50 clubs between 12th and 18th Street in a 6-block area. And they started at the river. Milton Morris's first club was the Hey Hey Club at 4th and Campbell, I believe it was, or Charlotte. And then they went out in the county. Lately, I've been researching the clubs out in the county. Tootie's Mayfair. And Tootie's was quite the place, man. Originally, it was the 79th and Troost. And then when they extended the city limit further south, he moved outside to 85th Street, stayed just right outside the city limit because they stay open all night long. And yeah, Kansas City jazz didn't end in the 1930s. It continues today. But, I'm involved in preserving and really researching the history. And then let me get back to my train of thought here. So that similar, situations arose in like New Orleans, but what usually ends the tradition is a crackdown. In 1917, the Secretary of the Navy, Josephus, I can't think of his last name. His last name was Josephus. Shut down Storyville. Storyville was the red light district where all the musicians worked, and so all those musicians, you can see the histories playing. Louis Armstrong and King Oliver went to Chicago. Same thing happened in Chicago, and all those musicians went to Kansas City and also went to New York. And New Orleans and Chicago Chicago jazz is highly derivative of New Orleans jazz, which is collective improvisation. And it really didn't evolve, but in Kansas City it did evolve. And another thing about Chicago, when you're looking at the history, they did not welcome musicians from other cities. They did not want the competition for their local musicians. When Thaman Hayes went there and played there, or Harlan Leonard, they were denied residencies at these clubs because the union would not let them play. They would not let them join the union. They treated them as traveling musicians, so they wouldn't let them stay there. So they always had to come back to Kansas City. But Kansas City opened the door wide to musicians from the Southwestern Territories. So-called territory bands, Southwest United States staked out in these vast territories. And these bands were based in small towns, and so they traveled great distances and played clubs all over the Southwest. During the Depression, when times got hard, they came to Kansas City, and the ranks of Local 627 grew from like 1928, I think they had 78 members, to over 327 members by the early 1930s. But Chicago didn't do that, and they suffered from it too. The history's ongoing, and I'm still learning,
Clint, you taught at UMKC, and there's obviously this incubator idea, passing it on takes place at a university. But in an informal way, does the tradition, how much of that tradition still lingers of older musicians passing it on to the younger crowd even today?
Well, I mean, not to be sort of self-promoting here, but I'm sort of a nice balance between both of those things. If I hadn't gone to UMKC and met Bobby, who was just very integral in getting us out. He wasn't, he's actually a really great classroom teacher and imparted a lot of wisdom in the classroom. But he just was so intent on getting us out. Go out and play, go out and hang, one of the things, and then as a side note to that, as I get older, I get a lot of younger musicians ask how they can break in or get a gig. And it's like, well, it's not rocket science. You just have to go out and meet people and play, and don't be a jerk when you go out and play, you know. So he did that. But then once we were out, and I would say I'm 43, everyone my age, and I would contend that the younger generation now too, you have to have a series of artistic patrons, not meaning monetarily patrons, but educating in the music. So for me, that was Carrie Strayer, Stan Kessler, you know, Al Pearson, and different musicians that would sort of, you know, like you're a baby, like don't touch that stove, you know, or good job, you know, or shut up, or things like that. That was all Stan mostly. But without those two things, you know, I learned the fundamentals of the music pretty strongly in the conservatory. But I learned the fundamentals of being a human being in the music world through the artists that you know. And then when I was in my 30s, I started a band up at Harling's where Boulevard Big Band used to play. And we played for 9 years every Tuesday, almost every Tuesday night. You know, sometimes a drummer wouldn't show up and then we couldn't play. But and it was a big band, and we played for 3 hours in this terrible, horrible, smelly bar. And we kind of got to see that process happen real time. Freshmen and sophomores would come up and play with us, and they'd be like, what is this? You know, and then Kerry Strayer, who was in his 50s at the time, he was always over there against the broken window with his baritone playing. And so there was this on-the-job kind of training. And I think that component of it is essential to your education as an artist. And informs your regionality. Certainly Kansas City is going to have a different set of inspiring educators. New Orleans definitely has their set. There's the trumpet mafia down there. All those kids come up through their thing, and the older people teach them how to play. And but I would say since 2020, and then just by the nature of being terminally online, I think that part of the equation, maybe on the artist level, needs the most, you know, cultivation. I think we're seeing that's kind of fading a little bit.
Yeah.
You know, we've talked in here about the folks on these banners. You guys have mentioned Bobby. Who else in your minds embodies the Kansas City sound, either back in the day or today? I mean, who immediately comes to mind, Chuck, when you think of the Kansas City sound, either today or even 20 years ago?
Well, I got to think about that one for a minute. You know, there's been so many of them, Herman Bell and George Salisbury that I knew, and, you know, so many keepers of the flames. Carmel Jones, you know, of course, was one of the keepers of the flames, but he's a kind of a case study, though, of what can happen to musicians. I started out working in the record business. I used to manage a store called Penny Lane out on Warren Elk.
They all know where that is.
And Broadway, and later it moved to Broadway. And I remember one time Carmel Jones came in we gave musicians $1 off on records. And we had this crazy cutout bins in the back where you could go in and buy Blue Note records for like $2.99. Mike Ning was a very good friend of mine. But Carmel Jones came in one day and he said, you know, do you have any openings here? And I said, Carmel, what do you mean, man? Working the record trade? He said, you couldn't get a gig, you know, at one point. And, you know, another funny thing is, you know, Bobby Watson, when he was a candidate for the Jazz Studies program at Conservatory, John Leisenring was still teaching there, teaching trombone. And a lot of these older classical faculty members were resistant to Bobby. And John Leisenring came to me and he said, man, he goes, you know, I'm having a hard time, you know, selling them on Bobby.
Wow.
He goes, what do we do? And I said, let's go to the Green Grove Dictionary of Jazz and let's get the citations for the musicians that are candidates. Bobby's was about that long, and the other guy wasn't even in there.
Yeah, right.
And then he came along, and he reinvigorated the program. And the program was strong that he inherited, too. I mean, because Mike Parkinson had been there, and, it was originally started by Bill Trumbauer. And John Elliott also taught, and Bob Brookmeyer went there, too. So, it just, he's responsible, I think, more than anybody for all the younger players in Kansas City, because everybody wanted to study with Bobby Watson because he was a working musician.
Yeah.
And he learned from, he was a great musician when he left Kansas City, but he learned from the master himself, Art Blakey.
Yeah, right.
Wynton's in that group. That's a group that's often overlooked.
Bradford, all those guys.
Yeah, just really great.
That was a good answer. It was not responsive to the question I asked. So I'm gonna turn over to.
I tell you who embodies this. Stan Kessler.
That's one of my guys.
Stan been around forever, and he learned. He was in the pocket with Baby Leroy. He could play rhythm and blues or soul, but also he's a great jazz player, and he learned from
a great guy.
Yeah, great guy too.
Debatable.
And he's Stan. That's one thing for sure. But he learned from Buddy Anderson and also from Piggy Minor, who's often overlooked. And those guys, played with Bird. And Stan, he just keeps on gigging, and also he's a good mentor to younger musicians. He's an inspiration to all of us. Arnie Young, they had a poster years ago, and I think they were playing at the Art Institute. And and Stan Kessler was on it, and the date, and it says STNKE, and then SSLER was on the next line.
Slur.
That's where Stanky Slur came from. Arnie Young gave him that. Arnie Young is also one of my heroes, because he's been playing free jazz here in Kansas City forever, and he is just, still going stronger than ever. And, I've known Arnie for a long time. So those are a couple of my heroes.
Yeah.
Good comeback on that answer. Clint, who would you add to that list?
If you want to get a little specific on it and who embodies sort of the characteristics that we attribute to the regional sound of Kansas City, I would say, definitely Bobby. Deborah Brown would be somebody that... she can sing bebop. She can sing, harmonically sophisticated like Sarah Vaughan,
yeah.
Betty Carter. But man, she embodies swing. She embodies. And when I say swing, I don't mean chompa 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 chompa. I mean just the way she bounces off the rhythms. You can swing over a straight eighth note, rock beat too. So Deborah for sure. Charles Williams. I think Charles is one of these folks that, he can play and sound like George Duke. He can play and sound like Oscar Peterson. But he's got, and he doesn't play, stride like another guy, Bram Winans, who certainly embodies classic Kansas City kind of swing, albeit a very sophisticated, intellect as he plays it. Charles can play stride, but again, it's not the style as much as it is the characteristics. And all those folks are really integral in perpetuating the soul of Kansas City jazz. And then for younger musicians, Herman Mahari, Peter Schlam, those folks don't sound really anything like the classic jazz era of musicians, although they can. But they embody that sort of, let's get after it, let's go to a session, let's sit in with each other, because that's a big component of what Kansas City music is. It's sitting in, the sit-in culture, the jam session culture. And I think they all sort of, Roger Wilder, Rod Fleeman, those folks all personify that
I get a
as well.
kick out of Rod. Rod's still knocking it out. When I was working
7 albums a month.
yeah, exactly. When I was working for Penny Lane, the first Dry Jack record was released. And Penny Lane had another business associated with them. It was a small label distributorship, and we distributed Inner City label. And we had a box of the new Dry Jack records up on the wall. And he walked into Penny Lane and went, wow. Let's not forget Bob Bowman either.
Oh, yeah.
I caught Bob
That's a
here
good
about
one.
2 months ago. And man, you talk about just a session, a blowing session where they were just enjoying themselves. You know, there's so many great players today. And the younger players coming up too. I was talking to Brett Jackson the other day. He came by the Sound Archive. And he's interested in a version of ornithology that I gave him when he was a student at UMKC. And he's talking about how his teaching gig now, you know, and how what a godsend that is because he gets benefits. His parents are real happy, and he can gig, you know.
You know, Chuck, help me with something here because, again, you mentioned early on about the four cradles of jazz, Chicago, New York, New Orleans, Kansas City. Why Kansas City? What was it about Kansas City that, yeah, I think my phone's buzzing too. Must be it's a Amber Alert, I bet you money, yeah. What was it about Kansas City that was open to becoming one of those cradles of jazz? I mean, why didn't it happen in St. Louis or Tulsa or Minneapolis? Why Kansas City?
Because it was a wide open town. It was anything goes.
The
I mean,
Pendergast stuff.
Yeah, I mean that traditionally, and it continues, you know, today. I mean, you know, a lot of times, you know, drug abuse and things like that, prostitution still happening today. It was because it was a wide open town, and there was plenty of work for musicians. But then again, also, Kansas City's always been a very welcoming place, and Kansas City also was a railroad hub. We were a railroad hub. If you're going northwest, south, or east, you came through Kansas City. And you can trace the migration patterns of African Americans through the railroads. And so and also Kansas City was a Jim Crow town. It was racist, but it wasn't as bad as down south. And also Kansas City had, if you look at the cities that really, they had large African American populations and an area like 18th and Vine. New York, it was Harlem. Chicago was the South Side. You know, and so that they had this, and it's really the invention of the African American community jazz is. I had to struggle with that with my Kansas City book, and the first chapter I covered all the white bands, and I gave Lauren McMurray, who hadn't been written about before, his due, the first virtuoso of the saxophone, and Coon Sanders. But at the end of that chapter, I said, however, Kansas City jazz was the invention of the musicians who worked at 18th and Vine. And it wasn't just 18th and Vine, there was also a large African-American community in Kansas City, Kansas, too.
Yeah.
And there was also an educational system within the community. We talk a lot about the conservatory, but Lincoln High, starting with Major N. Clark Smith, had a very strong jazz program. Walter Page went to Lincoln High, and they could play classical as well as jazz. Show me a classical musician that can play jazz. Very seldom do you see that.
Well, and that tradition certainly continued with Leon Brady,
Yeah.
Clarence Smith.
Yeah.
You know.
Oh yeah, Leon. Yeah, Leon comes right out of that tradition.
Yeah.
And you know, and I mean, there's a system. We talked about the system of informal education. Now that's passed on in the clubs, late night jam sessions, but also there's that formal. And Leo Davis at R.T. Cole's. See, there was only one, until 1936, there was only one African-American high school, and that was Lincoln High. And then R.T. Cole's came along. And R.T. Cole's was a technical school. If you want to learn how to fix cars, it's the same educational trend we're seeing today, even at the conservatory. Are you going to be able to get a job when you get out of school? But Leo Davis there, Bird studied with him too. And there was also jazz, there were instrumental music programs in the 5th grade. Charlie Parker first picked up the saxophone in about 1932 when he was going to Penn School, which is right down the street from here.
That's right. I remember you talking about, right down the street from Penny Lane.
Yeah.
Where the elementary school used to be.
Yeah.
I remember you talking about that once, and whenever I drive by that thing, I remember, Chuck told me about the elementary school here once. We drove around one day, you showed me that. Yeah. Well, let me ask you about the Jazz Orchestra, Clint, because it's a concert-style big band with a reputation for performing newly commissioned works. They're not a dance band, Is it keeping the Kansas City jazz sound alive, or is it charting something of a new direction?
I think anybody that's playing jazz music in Kansas City is just literally keeping the tradition moving. As far as KCJO is concerned, I think it's sort of like, we just talked about a little earlier, everything evolves over time. And I think the iteration that started 21, 22 years ago was more of like a repertory band, would play, the music of Stan Kenton, the music of Duke Ellington. We still do a little bit of that here and there. But like you said, we do a lot of arrangements based on a concert theme, but the arrangements are done from folks that are in the jazz orchestra themselves, or people from around Kansas City, Marcus Lewis, Dan Gailey, so on and so forth. And as far as like the philosophy that as an artistic director I bring to the group is, I want to find that. Like we do try and find a set of concert themes that might be interesting to people. From a traditional thing to video game music, but it's the performance, it's the artistry, it's the interpretation, it's the camaraderie of the folks in the group that kind of make it what it is. Yeah. And more I'm contending with that, and then also, I do ask myself before every chart I write or every concert we do, what does a 21st century Kansas City big band, what is it? What is that identity? And some days it's like, it doesn't matter. We're all in Kansas City and we're all playing as hard as we can with as much emotion as we can. So that's it. But a lot of times when I write, just like you'll hear Wynton Marsalis, Duke Ellington's his idol, but he still will throw some New Orleans stuff in there because that's part of him. I try and, really get into, and with Chuck maybe doesn't realize this, but with his guidance from the radio shows and talking to him a few times and reading his books, those little building blocks of what Kansas City jazz was, what does that mean today? So that's a long, obtuse answer, but it's somewhere in there. We do play a lot of blues. We do swing a lot, but it's certainly kind of a contemporary take on those things.
I'm going to read another quote again. Thanks to Daryl for pulling some of this together. But this is from Jeremy Pelt's group, the great trumpeter. His interview of Robert Glasper, who will always be a hero of mine because he was so kind to my youngest son once at the Folly. But Glasper says this: how is something that's supposed to be the freest of all music, jazz is supposed to be the freest, yet it's confined to a rhythmic pattern? It's supposed to be the freest music, but I don't know any R&B police. I don't know any hip-hop police. I know a lot of jazz police, yet we're the freest music, but we're the most policed. The soul is gone from the music, Glasper says, for the most part, so it's like that's not a thing people identify with jazz musicians anymore. Do you agree with that, Chuck? Is the soul gone from the music?
No. What's Samara Joy? Hello.
Hello.
Or just some of the great players that are coming up right now that play with so much soul. I disagree with that. There's always the jazz police, and I have fought the jazz police. I was part of the jazz police at one time until I realized that I was wrong. When we used to work for Penny Lane, Howard Rittmaster, who did the Jazz Olympics for many years, he was a traditionalist, and he didn't want to hear any fusion music. So we're not going to play any fusion music. And then when I started with KCUR, it'll be 40 years ago in October. And
that's worth a round of applause.
And I was working in the record business, and I wanted to make a parallel career move and be a jazz broadcaster. So I was doing jazz. And I would go in and do the Walt Bodine show from like 6 to 8. And I was his control room operator. I was the worst control room operator he ever had, and he loved me. And then I'd go on at 10 o'clock and play jazz until 2 o'clock in the morning. And DJ Harris and DJ Harris was the business manager. And DJ had very definite, she was the chief of the jazz police. And she had definite ideas about what she'd play. You know, you don't play any fusion music. You know, you don't want to play any, no blues, no rhythm and blues. And I did that for, about a year and a half. And then about in 1985, I said, I want to do something different. I don't want to be confined to this. You know, this swing jazz. And I went back recently and listened to an air check of me from that era, and I sound like I'm
You're
asleep.
a brave man.
I'm sounding like I'm asleep.
Yeah.
I was modulating my microphone, and but you know, I had to fight the jazz police. That's why when I did the fish fry, I said I want to be able to play whatever I want to play. And mix it up. And the challenge is to challenge, and this is with musicians too, is to challenge your viewers or your listeners, the people who attend your concert, without losing them. And once you got to catch their ear, and once you got their ear, you got it. You know, I was offered to do a show on KSDS, Jazz Across America. And I almost went back and did a jazz show. It's been a long time since I did it, but I'm not up on contemporary jazz. I listen to a lot of jazz radio. I've got my Bluetooth in the kitchen. And I listen to WBGO a lot.
Yeah, sure.
And KPR, I've been a KPR fan. Dick Wright was my mentor.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a very interesting relationship with Dick. And, but, you know, I'm just too busy, so I told, you got to check Sam Weissman out. And one of the things we got to work on KCUR is getting that Saturday jazz show back.
No, I agree with that. I
mean, that was always, and I've been advocating for that, and Sam would be a good candidate for that. Or Steve, you could do it.
235-1551. Ask for Ron Jones and tell him you want a jazz show. That's my advice.
Yeah, exactly. But you know, I mean, you know, but that's kind of like, you know, I had to break out of that. And Arnie Young used to say, you know, always go, listen to Eric Dolphy, because I was a swing jazz guy, you know, and you know, listen to Sun Ra and all that. And when Sun Ra would come play, I'd go see him. Yeah. Changed my world. Yeah. Yeah. And I think we need to be more broad-minded about what is jazz.
Clint, is the soul gone, as Robert Glasper says?
Well, so Robert Glasper is Aristotle, you know, or I mean Socrates. He's more like Socrates, I guess. But he's a philosopher, and I think he poses a lot of, I don't know him, so I shouldn't say Robert Glasper is this, but he poses a lot of things to think about. But it always gets me, jazz musicians spend so much time talking about how jazz is dead, or like we talk about what is jazz, and I don't like the word jazz, and I mean Nicholas Payton called it Black American music. I think that's pretty right on, you know, but I think there's a lot of like people have been arguing about like jazz is dead since 1959, and I think it's just such a waste of energy. You know, I think it's fine that some people call it jazz. I think it's fine that some people don't, but I would ask, you know, Robert, like, who are you listening to that isn't putting their whole soul in this music? We're not doing it for the money, that's for sure. You know, we're not doing it for adulation and riches. We're doing it because of an intense love and desire to participate in this massive historic dialogue between our heroes, you know, these folks on stage, Bobby Watson, Herman Mahari, you know, and I think that anytime you put your whole self into anything, especially an art form, well, there's nothing but soul in the music. So I don't really know where that is. I don't like the whole jazz police thing. I mean, I've heard stories about it, you know, with the radio, and there was a lady that came up to me at one of our concerts that I thought was a great concert. It was a little more forward-thinking, contemporary, and she just very, very sweet. She said, "This is the worst music I've ever heard in my life." And I was like, now I had that split second. I could have responded in two ways. One would be, you're wrong, which is the 2024 way of any sort of conversation. but I said, well, I can understand that maybe this isn't for you. Like, this isn't music that you have chosen to listen to in your life. But from a lot of people's perspective, this is objectively some great music. Stylistically, it's different, but you have to remember that jazz is a 4-letter word, but it's a many thousand letter, encompassing of the styles, or some other poetic way of putting that. And when the Police come along, I don't feel like a lot of jazz artists really care. I mean, that lady, she bought a ticket, and I definitely heard what she said, but that's not going to change the way that I want to share the beautiful nature of all jazz. And like, I don't listen to Cecil Taylor a lot. I've listened to a lot of Cecil Taylor. I don't listen to Cecil Taylor as much as other musicians, but that doesn't mean that I don't respect him as an artist and as a voice and as someone who was putting his whole spirit into what he did. It's like hockey. I didn't grow up playing hockey. I don't really watch a lot of hockey. I think it's awesome.
Right.
So.
Right. Yeah. Well, I want to take your questions in just a minute, but I want to shift the conversation just a little bit. One of the things that KC Jazz Alive is interested in is this notion of trying to encourage and boost the idea of Kansas City as a jazz tourism destination, trying to capitalize on our heritage. Chuck, what thoughts do you have on what needs to happen to move us more in that direction?
Great question.
I think there needs to be more clubs and more support of jazz in the clubs. Think about a lot of the great jazz clubs. Sometimes you don't miss it until it's gone. Like for blues people, it's the Grand Emporium, and for jazz people, think about Jardines.
Oh yeah.
And City Light and these great jazz clubs. I'm meeting with John O'Brien next week, and John is the one that he designs clubs, and he does projects. And he's working with the new owners of the Plaza, and they're talking about, opening a jazz club on the Plaza, which would be nice
exciting.
because
There you go.
It's not like there's not already jazz clubs on the Plaza. You've got the Steakhouse, you've got the Raphael Hotel, and there's 2 or 3 clubs there. But when you get a synergy of a number of clubs in an area, that the sum becomes greater than the parts, and I think that's really important. That's what needs to happen. More
Well,
clubs.
that's exciting what you just said. That's new to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's just between us, okay? Well, they're interested in historic photos. Also, you have Adam Jones is going to open a club right across the street from the Blue Room. And that corner club there, he's taking his time, but he's going to do it
for a while. Yeah.
And he's going to do it. He's the man developed the West Side and then the West Bottoms too. And so there's more jazz clubs coming up, but we need more of them, and to revere that tradition. But also, what we need more of is jazz radio. I listen to KKFI, and I like what they do, and I listen to KPR. And
I listen to
WBGO,
KPR, yeah.
And I have KSDS, and and also KUVO. Mm-hmm. I'll drive my wife crazy because I like to stay up late at night and listen to jazz radio. But that's the way I keep up with what's happening today. I don't go out and buy records or get downloads, because I'm occupied doing. I program 8 hours of radio a week. That's 28 tracks. So that's got my full attention. So at night I want to have a little taste of wine and, listen to some jazz in the kitchen. And I also clean the kitchen when I do it too. She likes that part of it.
It's a good way to get that done. Clint, what about the jazz tourism idea?
I agree with Chuck. I think that I'm not like that old yet. Hopefully I will be, but in my 20 years or whatever of being a musician, I've seen an ebb and flow. In 2013, 2015, there were a bunch of clubs that opened up and they've kind of gone away. And I would assume that, the hills and valleys will keep moving. But I do think that there a lot of the clubs that exist now, they're on one hand, it's great that there's music in them, and you look at the Green Lady and you see that place is packed because it's a cool spot. You know, you feel cool when you walk in. It's in a good, highly populated area. People walk in off the street, they hear about it, and so on. I mean, if I could, not that he would listen to me, but if I could challenge, John on that, it would be like put some diversity in your artist roster. I mean, there are a lot of great horn players. I'm not saying this is a trumpet player. I'm plenty busy, but like there are a lot of great horn players in Kansas City that are not playing often. There's no regular gigs for Adam Larson or Matt Otto or these folks that are like the highest level of jazz. And it's kind of weird to me that there are these like objectively great artists that are not out on the scene a lot.
And that's because why?
No clue. I mean, I have no idea. I think that, well, yeah, but the places that there are to play are not, there's a little bit, they keep a thing. And I don't want to like say that I know how to run a club and make it profitable, because I don't. But I would love to see the clubs, and this is not just the Green Lady, but the clubs that have music. I think, not to blow his own horn, but Tom does a great job here. There's a super diverse group of artists and musicians, a lot of younger groups that play here, from straight ahead to, freely minded stuff. There's a lot of really good avant-garde players in Kansas City that, I mean, this is everywhere, but they have to kind of find a spot to play. I think that, you look at history of music dating back to whatever, patronage, like funding people that, that donate and create spaces for art to happen. I think that that's happening less and less. And then the last thing, I was thinking about this, in 2018, KCJO went to Europe. We played in Hanover for a festival, like 25,000 people there. That was cool. But then we went with Deborah Brown to Szczecin, Poland. Yeah. And I was talking to went out one night with a couple trumpet players, a little too late in a country where no one spoke, at least where these guys took us. We were somewhere, and we were hanging deep into the night, and they were telling us about this city. It was a shipbuilding city, but then it was going, and then the government decided to make basically a ministry or department of culture, and they really put a lot of intentionality in government, sort of like, whatever, all of it, into art, into music, into dance. And now their number one, thing in that city is culture, is art, is music. And, again, I don't know how to run a club. I don't know how to run a city. I'm not going to pretend that I know, but it would be beautiful if we could find a way to do that, because as we as people, and on the tourism thing, you have to create with jazz radio, with art in general. I think as a society, we really have to remember that the benefits of art are just well documented. Everyone knows that there are benefits of art, but we kind of fight this battle against an increasingly literal society. All of our entertainment anymore is very literal. The music, and I don't hate on pop music or anything. My kid loves Taylor Swift, like, it's cool. But the music, the lyrics, the beats, everything is very literal. There's nothing really abstract to stuff. Television shows. What's a common thing people do about TV shows? When the show's over, they go, well, I wish it wouldn't have ended that way. They should have done this. Well, it's not your story to tell, And that literal kind of entertainment that we have, it doesn't have any of the benefits that abstraction has. dance is abstract. It's beautiful. Jazz is abstract, and that stimulates our brains. It stimulates our mind. But then how do you market that, to people in and outside of town? I think it comes from an intentional, all community, focus on remembering that art and promoting art and just putting it out there for free for people to hear. I mean, the musicians need to get paid, but it has to be there. You walk off a plane in New Orleans, what do you hear? You walk down Beale Street, you hear blues. You walk in Kansas City, it's like, where is it? So I'd love to hear that coming from, the folks that the man, I guess.
If we wanted to really increase our tourist profile and more of a tourist destination, it'd be nice to bring back Kansas City Blues and Jazz Festival.
Yeah.
Hallelujah.
It's been such a struggle, hasn't it?
Yeah, and because Kansas City had an incredible, back in the 1960s, had an incredible jazz festival where it would be at Municipal Auditorium, and they would have it for a week. And there would be musicians playing in department stores. And Lester Milgram and a lot of the other movers and shakers funded that. And then, of course, you had these Sprint Jazz Festival, which was at the, and those were very well attended. I got a chance to meet Andy Kirk there. And they presented a wide variety of jazz styles. They were well attended.
Parks and Rec.
Yeah, in the park. Think about the Sundays in the park series, where you had Charles Mingus playing at Swope Park, George Shearing, Gary Burton with Pat Metheny at Brush Creek. There needs to be more of that kind of stuff. I mean, the clubs are nice. They're the key, don't get me wrong. I was on the booking committee for the Kansas City Blues and Jazz Festival when it was at Penn Valley Park. And you had the jazz stage and you had the blues stage. And people would move easily between the two. And one of the challenges we had was headliners at that time. But the city did not get behind it. It was a grassroots effort run by Kathy Call and Connie Humiston and all these crazy women. And it's always the women that get things done, all these crazy little women we have here in Kansas City. And the city made it cost prohibitive to have the festival, because we'd have to pay like $10,000, to use the facilities. And we're packing it in. When Bloodstone played here, my God, everybody came out of the woodwork. Al Green, and all the jazz greats that played there too. That would be, I think, a major step forward, and do it earlier in the years, early June, when the weather's nice.
Well, and one thing on that too, I think when I had that band up at Harlings, which is a much smaller scale than a giant festival, but it was a rehearsal band. We weren't getting anything but free drinks, and we weren't even supposed to get those. But if we missed a week, if I didn't have a critical mass of a band, or the drummer didn't show up or whatever, and we missed a week, well, our crowd, it took, and these folks came up, there were some jazz fans, but it was just like Midtown, like people, whatever, just people. They would just come up and drink cheap beer, and we would make a ruckus, and the vibes were good. But if we missed a week, that 100 plus person crowd, it would take like 2 or 3 weeks for them to remember that was a thing again. And I think that, there's a lot of great stuff happening in Kansas City, but sort of it feels like that. Like there a lot of things. The Prairie Village Jazz Festival, that's a well-attended festival,
It is.
but our attention spans are so short that 2 weeks after it's over, you forget that jazz exists, and then you have to build it back up the momentum. So it would be nice to see. I mean, metaphorically, it'd be nice if the drummer didn't not show up. We could keep playing every week somehow.
I was also thinking about. I didn't mean to jump in here, but just riffing on that. Also, at that time, you had jazz festival. You had people were writing about jazz, in the Kansas City Star.
It was in the paper.
In the 1930s, Davy Dexter Jr., who's one of the great writers of all times and a personal inspiration to me and a friend and a mentor, was writing about, he had a column in the Journal Post. And he was writing not only about what was happening downtown on 12th Street, but also was at 18th and Vine. He covered the black bands as well as the white bands. And we have that today with plastic sacks, but there needs to be more of that.
More of that.
You know, like KCUR could do a lot more in terms of just, you know, what's happening around town, who's playing around town. One place where you can go, I do a calendar every Friday night and Saturday night at the Fish Fry, and I include the jazz and blues gigs too. It takes me about 5 minutes to get through it. And I've often debated about, you know, whether that's a good thing, but I think we owe it to musicians. And this is a place that I mention often. You know, the Sons of Brazil, Sunday night, 6 o'clock. But there needs to be, the media shifted so much, I'm not sure how it would work, but I think it would. Just a good community calendar for music.
You know, speaking of great things coming up and something to look forward to, August 24th, Chuck, the Charlie Parker, Spotlight Charlie Parker event, you're going to lead a morning walking tour of 18th and Vine again. 18th and Vine again. Tell us a little bit more about what you got going there.
Well, we've been doing this for years, and my partner in crime, Jerry, is former archivist for the Black Archives and also the American Jazz Museum. And we lead a walking tour, and it's a very successful tour. There's a lot of demand for it. And just talk about 18th and Vine and what was there. I gave a tour one time when a poet told me he'd never had he seen so much that wasn't there. And we're going to be doing that, and then I'm going to be, of course, introducing the Kansas City Jazz Orchestra at the Folly Theater on the 28th. And on the 29th, I'm going to do a program on some recently discovered recordings of Charlie Parker here in Kansas City at the American Jazz Museum. I think one of the things we need to do, too, to promote jazz in Kansas City is have more integration among the groups that are promoting jazz in Kansas City.
Yeah.
The American Jazz Museum, you know, I've had my issues with them in the past, but I really enjoy working with them, and Dr. Dina Bennett's great to work with, and their collections people are, and I think there's more opportunities there for partnerships too, and we need to reach out to that. And the Jazz Ambassadors also, with the Jazz Ambassador magazine, I always used to love to see it in the places, and I don't see it anymore, you know, out. It's not paper anymore, and I'm
paper.
cool with that.
I
I just don't see it, you know.
Yeah.
Of course, I don't
You
go out
should
in the
be
clubs
seeing it.
either. Yeah, we could do more with that too. That needs to be beefed up, and bring the Jazz Ambassadors, Kansas City Jazz Alive, the Mutual Musicians Foundation, and American Jazz Museum together when we're celebrating Charlie Parker, and do more event coordination. That's what we need to do. Yeah, I know you guys are too. I'm looking towards the future, and things are getting better. Yes.
Have to admit.
What questions do you have for our good panel? Yeah, sir.
Chuck, you may remember in the 80s, first started listening to jazz in the 80s. Under Mayor Berkeley, we had the Kansas City Jazz Commission, 2 members. They were paid and were big shot attorneys. However, would you agree that they did a lot for tourism and marketing of Kansas City jazz when people
Thanks, John.
to the town tours and all that? I vividly remember a bunch of Chinese group was having a convention here, and they went around to.
Oh, it was the Jazz Commission. There's been a number started over the years, and I think you're talking about the Jazz Commission, which former Mayor Berkeley did a lot to promote jazz in Kansas City.
Do we need another one?
I think it doesn't have to be that big. I think though, if maybe a monthly get together with all the various parties, and I think a commission. Yeah, I think we need an umbrella to bring everybody together. And I know we're doing a lot of outreach, and it really is working now. But with the Jazz Ambassadors came out of the Kansas City Jazz Commission. Everybody was a jazz commissioner. There were 300 members of the Jazz Commissioner.
Give birth to the ambassadors.
Yeah, and it was.
The Blue Society, which no longer exists. Really?
Yeah, they're still there. Blue Society's still going strong. This Blue Society's doing good. I just talked to Betty Berry today, and she's doing fine. But yeah, I think there should be some kind of umbrella organization maybe to help coordinate things and bring people together. Just sit down at a table, have lunch, and talk. Compare notes.
How about somebody, yeah, Chris?
We were talking about important.
Got a microphone. Emily's bringing over a microphone here.
If I can make this work, okay. We were talking about important contemporary artists. Logan Richardson comes to mind to me.
Yeah.
He's known all over the world, and when I came here back home 23 years ago, he was just getting started. He was just barely a teenager, hadn't gone to Berkeley or Manhattan School of Music. Clint, what do you think the impact of somebody like Logan Richardson's generation? He's probably about your age, close
We're
to
the
it?
same age. I think
Okay.
He was class of 98 like I was. He went to Paseo.
Okay.
I think he went to Paseo.
What do you think of your generation then? How is your generation
I like
impacting
my
the music?
generation.
How is
I have to.
How is it
It's like the
impacting
Who,
the music,
talking
though?
about
I
my
think,
generation.
I think you're coming of age and you're having a great impact on the music. That's the point I'm trying to get to. Like, I didn't hear Logan mentioned, and he's a really
Well, I mean,
important jazz
it's one of
musician.
those things where like you can't mention everybody. I'd throw Herman and Peter in there because they're here, But I mean, shoot, we'd be here for as long as Chuck has to read the jazz calendar to mention everybody. I mean, I think Logan is such a pivotal figure. I mean, he's one of the 4 or 5 contemporary voices on alto saxophone in the generation after Bobby, and I think that he certainly has a lot of Kansas City up in him, in his playing, but is another one of those great representatives that you don't have to play mote and swing to be a Kansas City jazz musician. I mean, Logan certainly influenced Herman Mahari heavily, and Michael Schultz and Ben Leifer and a whole bunch of people, Brian Lee. So yeah, I mean, Logan is at the vanguard of the whatever we are. Exennials? I don't know. My daughter has to tell me what generation I'm in.
Well, I think that points to the issue of how do you cultivate a younger audience. I mean, looking around the room here, well, we've all been around for a while. Some of us longer than others. And how do you bring in cultivate a new audience? And I think Logan, when he incorporates contemporary music genres into his music, it helps broaden it, yeah. And it goes along with our broadening our definition of jazz. What is jazz? But I think that's the challenge, is to get the younger audiences in there and get them excited about what's happening.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Nelson, they're reaching out to the Nelson Museum. Atkins they're reaching out to young people all the time.
Yeah.
There's a good example right there. It's art.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I used to
Getting a gig there is kind of hard.
I used to book the Nelson Art Gallery for a while, and I booked in Karen Allison, and she was playing downtown at the Phoenix, and she got in trouble because she came in through the front door when the people were supposed to come to the back door, and they used to have a successful Friday jazz series there too. And a lot of these cultural organizations, there's a lot of cross-pollination among the arts. Among my circle of friends, I've got musicians, I've got artists, writers, So it's all part of the whole. Jazz is really all part of the whole of the cultural fabric of Kansas City.
Well, and I think that the young people do go out and they do populate places, and they listen to jazz music, and they listen to whatever, and they drink $2 beers and they drink $15 cocktails, and they're out in society. But I think that there's so many options to pick from, and then also there are not that many options for young people to go listen to kind of young people music that is jazz. And I think that, you know, I mean, thinking about this panel, now I would show up to this panel. I'm 43, but this probably isn't a thing that a 25-year-old would come to. And just because they don't come to this doesn't mean that they're not going out to other things. I would just like to point that out.
Well, Clint, we won't hold it against you. You're only 43, man. Another thing that needs strengthening and support too are our jazz series at the Folly. And hats off to the Kauffman Foundation for putting their money where their mouths are when it comes to supporting the Kansas City Jazz Orchestra.
Well, we still have to pay a lot of money to play at the Kauffman Center.
And I mean, it's a great venue, and they do showcase jazz artists. And the Folly, you know, is kind of struggling a little bit, and we need to make sure that that's a really, because that follows into your tourism too. We need to. There's so many different aspects of our jazz culture here that need to be shored up a little bit.
I think Gail can probably talk about that too. How about the woman way in the back, and then we'll. Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
So we get around quite a bit downtown and 18th and Vine and checking out jazz. And one of the things I've often thought about is, would it be a benefit if there was more of a audience involvement, I guess, like dancing or. I guess I look back at a lot of these people on these placards behind you, and I suspect those clubs were hopping and people were dancing, and you know what I mean? Whereas it seems like most of the jazz that we go see, we like sit and watch and we clap, and you know what I mean? And I mean, we sit at Green Lady and watch younger folks come in, and they're there for 10 minutes, and then they walk back out, and I'm like, man, you know, they just need like something where people are like involved, and you know what I mean? Like I suspect you go to New Orleans and there's like call and response and a lot of those types of things, but I'm just curious what you guys think about that.
I mean, I've seen people dance to inherently undanceable music. And I think that, again, I mean, not to put too much like stress on the venues, but if you had a venue where there was like some space to dance, or like KCJO, we don't play dances, but it's not that we wouldn't. We have before. We played down at Union Station. We played, you know, some different dances. We play one at Liberty Hall every December that's sold out like instantly. It's like it's our Taylor Swift Eras tour. You know, it's like you can't get a ticket. But it, just not to get into the boring business side of things, it costs so much money. Well, not even so much money. It costs enough money for us to play that we don't break even on doing a big band dance. And I think that that's a shame, because you know, people that don't give a hoot about jazz music will absolutely dance to some jazz music if they're given the opportunity. But I think those opportunities aren't. You know, I played a bunch of gigs with Steve Miller at the end of his run out at that ballroom on wherever the heck that was out south, and nobody cared. It's like the Dizzy Gillespie coat. Nobody cared what we were playing. I could play alter pentatonics and all my solo. Steve wouldn't liked it, but people were just there to have a good time, and I think that there's not a space for that. People would dance at Harling's to Thad Jones tunes. Like, wow. It's not danceable, but they would get lit up and dance all night long. It was great.
Show them some of your moves. You were showing me some of your moves before the thing.
I'm on the DL.
Yeah.
I got a hip. Well, it's 6 to 8 weeks.
You know, generally speaking, I do like to watch white people dance. But you know, that's another important component that's missing here. Is the dancing. I agree with that, because traditionally in Kansas City you had these magnificent dance places like the Playmore, the El Torreon, the dance. If you've never seen the dance pavilion out at Fairyland, it was pretty magnificent. And the El Torreon ballroom is still there upstairs.
Yeah, it is.
It has not been changed. And so, and Vince Giordano proves that in New York City, where he plays dance music and people dance to it. There's many different rooms in the House of Jazz. And there's a room for concert bands. There's a room for free jazz. And there's also a room for the scamps, because that's when people would dance to the scamps. Boy, Steve, those guys were a really good hang, let me tell you.
Let's go way in the back.
Okay, I have a couple of thoughts. First of all, I go to the jam at the Uptown Lounge on Tuesday nights, and they've begun live streaming it, and the younger jazz musicians are coming in as a result of that. And then the jazz academies have really touched a lot of younger players, and at their jams on Monday nights, sometimes they fill the house, and then as soon as all their compatriots are finished playing, they leave. But and then how about the 1% part of the city budget that's allocated to art? Wouldn't that? What do you mean very little? Who said very little? I know it's mostly visual, but jazz is
Why
an
not
art form too.
spread it out?
That's
Yeah.
my point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. Anybody else? Yeah. Yes, sir. Emily, way in the back, way, opposite corner. Got a long run here.
I will say that Kansas City, Missouri does give arts organizations money through the Neighborhood Tourism Development Fund, and this is one of them. So they do fund music and performing arts.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to cut to the chase. My point of view, I'm originally from Africa, and I moved here to America about a decade ago. And I'm a professional bass player here on the scene. Many of you don't know me because I'm always in the back, hiding, making the music feel good. 2026, there's a soccer World Cup coming here in Kansas City. I want to hear from our guests on stage, what would be your thought? What would be, if you were given the power to change or make something great coming out of that 2026 World Soccer Cup, what would you do for the jazz scene in Kansas City?
Well, there's a collective of people that are really trying to figure that out, and how to put jazz music especially, but art in general, just out into the public. I don't think I'm saying anything that's like, I shouldn't, whatever, I'm saying anyway. But so we as an organization are kind of, we're abreast of what, like our PR person that does PR for a lot of different groups around, the symphony and different things. We're trying to, one, advocate for jazz in general, and then artists that are playing jazz of a wide variety of styles, not just like a trio or a big band or whatever, but everybody that plays different styles. And I think this idea of jazz just being part of the tapestry when people come through the city, of it just being there, just like when you go to a Chiefs game and you smell barbecue, I would love it if jazz was just everywhere, on speakers, a duo on a street corner, a flash mob, big band, a concert on Barney Isles Platte, like wherever. That would be what I would love to see. And then I would selfishly like to see more of it, not just live, but represented by the media. When the NFL draft came through here, there was kind of a suggestion that no one should play a gig that night, the first night of the NFL draft.
Wow.
And then we had a concert on day 3 of the draft, which no one checking out. I mean, I don't know if you have bets on Mr. Irrelevant or anything, but nobody really, and there wasn't a lot of we tried to market it or whatever, but you think of these kind of large scale events, the 2015 World Series, I had a band scheduled to play game 1, and as people walk in, it got rained out. We snuck in and watched the game. That was great. But there's not a media representation of these things that are happening. I would have loved to seen more jazz. Like every once in a while you'll see like Lonnie McFadden or somebody will be represented on Monday Night Football. That's awesome. I think we need way more of that.
Oh, yeah.
You know, just bring what we share to everyone that's watching it live and in person here, but also, you know, streaming on TV, et cetera.
I think Lonnie McFadden really embodies the tradition. Of course, Smiling Jimmy McFadden, his father, was the major dancer and MC here in Kansas City, and he's carrying on that tradition, and unabashedly. You know, I think one of the things we kind of have a tendency to think about is, you know, when we're talking about like Kansas City jazz and how do we make it as a better tourist destination, how do we promote it and all that. We've got an incredible jazz scene here. I'd put it up against Los Angeles, you know, or comparable cities. You can go out and hear jazz music every night. And I think sometimes we say, poor old us. And you know, how do we do this? When you go to Europe and tell people you're from Kansas City, they go, jazz.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, we have the reputation internationally, and I think we need to kind of like, you remember, what's it, Smalley? I'm big enough. I'm good enough.
Yeah.
I can do this. You know, that's kind of like what we're like here in Kansas City. When we've got this great scene, and of course, we just want to make sure it's stronger and it's passed on.
That's a good way to end. Let's give a round of applause to Chuck and Clint for coming in tonight. You guys are great. Thank you so much. Thank you.
I could hang with these guys all night. I love this discussion. As Kansas City Jazz Alive's newest board member, I do want to say we are a jazz advocacy organization here in Kansas City, and we're trying to do a lot of the things that you folks were asking about. We do want to bring together, and we are working together to bring together with the ambassadors, with the Jazz Museum, with the foundation. And so that's really one of our big calls, is to right the ship, to really see us all starting to work together. For the World Cup, I would love to see a new pub crawl using the new streetcar going up and down Main Street. And yeah, I put that bug in a few people's ears on that. And so, you know, bringing that really to life, having clubs happening in the hotels, in the lobbies of the hotels, in the restaurants, so that when all the Germans come here for a base camp and they want to hear Kansas City jazz, they're going to have the opportunity to hear Kansas City jazz. You've got an opportunity to hear Kansas City jazz this next month. We are doing our Spotlight Charlie Parker celebration, and this year we are going to be promoting things all month long in August. So we've got on August 4th at the Phoenix, we'll do our kickoff brunch. We'll be doing KC Beer on August 16th with Bram and Kadesh Flow. The 16th. Is it the 15th? Okay, I got the wrong date on my thing here. The bird salute has now been moved to Charlie Parker's birthday on the 28th, or is it the 29th? The 29th. Boy, my calendar is bad. And so that'll be happening that morning. All the things that the American Jazz Museum is doing that Chuck was talking about is going on all that day. There's going to be all kinds of events happening that day. On August 20th, we're doing another one of these sessions, and that's going to be at the Kansas City Library, the Central Library upstairs in the Hellsberg Hall. We're going to have Carl Allen on that panel. We're going to have Carolyn Glenn Brewer on that panel. We're going to have Houston Smith Jr. on that panel. So we are bringing in some youth to talk about things, to talk about Charlie Parker for that. And then, of course, then the 24th with the walking tour in the morning, and then the Folly concert with the Kansas City Jazz Orchestra that evening, with Chuck giving us a little bit of history lesson again for that event, I believe.
That's the 28th now.
Is it the 28th now?
Yeah.
No, it's the 24th.
Okay.
Yeah, it's definitely the 24th.
Well, I'm using your calendar.
Oh, no. So anyway, where can they find the calendar? You can find our calendar at spotlightcharlieparker.org. Actually, I've got a sheet up here with some QR codes on it too, that if you want to scan on different things that way. If you want to know stuff that's going on in Kansas City all the time, I say go to KKFI's website. They've got a wonderful calendar that Roger Wilder puts together every week. So there's jazz happening all over Kansas City, folks, including here. And for getting the youth involved, I'm just starting to kind of incubate a little bit. One of our stations that I want to do in October, I'm thinking about bringing in our 20-somethings and having them sit on this panel, so it's not us gray-haired guys talking. And so, yes.
What are you talking about? I don't have it here.
So one more time for, hey, I'm included in that batch. So one more time for Steve Kraske, Chuck Haddix, Clint Ashlock. Thank you so much for coming out.
Hey, nice job, as always, Doc. That was funny. Hey, Clint, thanks again.